Ah, the parsnip. You probably wouldn't expect this humble root to be the medieval equivalent of French fries, but in the cold, frost-bitten winters of Europe, it was a star. People didn't stroll into a medieval tavern asking for a side of crispy parsnips, but they sure relied on them. While potatoes didn't make their grand debut in European kitchens until much later, parsnips were the go-to veggie for nutrition and versatility. What made parsnips stand out back then wasn't just their sweet taste, which I swear only got better after a good frost, or their carrot-like appearance. No, it was the fact that they were tough. Parsnips survived winters that would make any modern vegetable shrivel up and die. Frost? Bring it on. Poor soil? No problem. These bad boys were as resilient as that one cousin who keeps showing up at family gatherings, despite your best efforts to avoid them. And unlike today's picky veggies, parsnips thrived in less than ideal conditions. In a typical medieval winter, when fresh produce was as rare as a unicorn sighting, parsnips came to the rescue. A single medium-sized parsnip, about the size of your forearm, packed a punch of 100 calories, fiber, vitamin C, and potassium. In a world where food could be scarce, these unassuming roots became a reliable source of energy. In fact, during particularly brutal winters, peasants would get a large portion of their daily calories from parsnips. Talk about a diet plan that works when you're literally living off whatever survives the frost. Medieval cooks didn't just slice parsnips and throw them on a plate either. Oh no, they mashed them like potatoes, only without the butter and cream. Roasted them beside meats, or used them to thicken stews. And for the sweet tooth? You guessed it, parsnips were even used in medieval desserts. Imagine a carrot cake without the carrots, and instead, you've got parsnips playing the lead role. It's like the underdog of medieval food, sneaking into dishes when you least expect it. So, next time you're chowing down on your French fries, just think of the parsnip. It's the unsung hero of medieval Europe. And honestly, I wouldn't mind seeing a little more of it in our modern-day diets. But who am I kidding? We've all got a soft spot for fries, parsnips included, if you can get past the, hey, it's not a potato moment. Now, let's talk about emmer wheat, a grain that's kind of like the rugged, dependable older brother of the more glamorous modern wheat. Emmer wheat was the workhorse of the medieval diet. It wasn't flashy, didn't have the smooth appeal of modern bread, but it was a key player in keeping people fed during those long, harsh winters. When the weather wasn't in your favor, emmer wheat was there to hold it all together. This grain was a bit of a survivor, thriving in rocky, poor soils where other grains would just give up. Emmer was hardy enough to grow in places where the soil had seen better days. I mean, if modern wheat were a high-maintenance diva, emmer wheat was more of a, I'll take what I can get and still look good kind of crop. It didn't mind the tough conditions. Those long, bitter winters weren't going to stop it. While today's wheat needs pretty specific growing conditions to thrive, emmer was adaptable, growing in the kind of dirt that wouldn't even make the cut in an Instagram farming photo. But here's the kicker. Emmer wheat wasn't just about being tough, it was also about being nutritious. It packed 30% more protein than your standard wheat, which was essential when you didn't have access to high-protein foods like meat on a daily basis. It was rich in zinc, iron, and magnesium, so it gave medieval folks a solid nutritional boost. You'd think bread made from emmer would have been something soft and fluffy, but no, it was dense and hearty. Think of it like a whole wheat bread on steroids. The bread you made from emmer would keep you full for hours, especially during those long days of hard work in the fields. Plus, it was super versatile. You could bake it into hearty loaves, use it in stews, or even turn it into a porridge. But emmer wheat wasn't just about nutrition. It was also the lifeblood of medieval economies. If emmer wheat prices spiked, or there was a shortage, well, let's just say it wasn't just the peasants who noticed. Bread riots, anyone? If the price of bread got too high, it wasn't just a couple of disgruntled peasants with pitchforks, it was the whole community. People had a real, vested interest in emmer wheat. It wasn't just about filling stomachs, It was about surviving. And as much as we like to think of medieval times as romantic and heroic, the reality was a bit more cutthroat when it came to food security. If the emmer didn't grow, neither would the people. So, in a way, emmer wheat was one of those behind-the-scenes heroes that kept medieval life ticking along. It didn't have the glamour of the parsnip or the sparkle of some trendy superfood. But without emmer, there'd have been a lot fewer full bellies around the medieval world. If you ever find yourself lamenting the lack of a decent loaf of bread today, just remember, you're probably living in an era that owes a lot to this unassuming grain. It's the foundation upon which much of medieval society was built. Fava beans, the humble legumes that played a starring role in medieval European diets. While today we might think of them as an exotic addition to a salad, or something to toss into a trendy grain bowl, back then, fava beans were the unsung heroes, providing much-needed protein to every social class. You didn't have to be royalty or a wealthy merchant to get your hands on these little guys. No, fava beans were something that even the poorest peasants could grow and eat, and they were packed with more protein than you could shake a stick at. In fact, a single acre of fava beans could yield about 1,500 pounds of dried beans. That's enough to provide around 500 pounds of complete protein. Now, compare that to raising cattle, which would require 15 acres of land to produce the same amount of protein. It's no wonder fava beans were such an essential part of the medieval diet, especially for peasants who couldn't afford meat on a regular basis. And here's the kicker. Fava beans didn't just fill you up, they kept you going. They were dense, hearty, and could provide energy for long, grueling days of labor. Whether you were building a castle, tending to fields, or just surviving the endless grind of medieval life, fava beans were a reliable, affordable source of protein. But it wasn't just their protein content that made fava beans so valuable. These little legumes also played a crucial role in crop rotation systems. Legumes, like fava beans, have this cool relationship with soil-dwelling bacteria that captures nitrogen from the air and turns it into a form of nitrogen that plants can use. This act of natural fertilization helped enrich the soil for future crops, making fava beans a key player in maintaining soil health. It's almost like they were the unsung farmers' assistants, doing their part to make sure that the land stayed fertile and productive for the next season's harvest. Of course, fava beans weren't without their downsides. Some people, especially those of Mediterranean descent, carried a genetic trait known as glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, G6PD deficiency. This meant that consuming fava beans could trigger a dangerous condition called favism, which caused everything from anemia to organ failure. Medieval folks didn't have the science to understand the genetic causes behind this, but they did know to be cautious about eating too many fava beans if they had a family history of illness. Despite this, fava beans continued to be a staple of medieval agriculture and cuisine. And even though their prominence has faded in the modern world, their legacy lives on. In many regions, especially in North Africa and the Middle East, dried fava beans are still ground into flour to make bread, or cooked into hearty stews. The contribution of fava beans to medieval society was invaluable. These humble beans helped sustain workers and peasants, powered monumental projects, and kept medieval society going during tough times. Fava beans were more than just a food, they were a symbol of resilience. They fed the people when fresh meat or vegetables were scarce, and they contributed to the health of the soil. And while they may not get the attention they deserve today, I think it's high time we give these little guys the credit they deserve. Let's talk about buckwheat. Now, here's a crop that was kind of like the Swiss Army knife of medieval agriculture. If you're imagining buckwheat as just a trendy gluten-free alternative to oatmeal, well, you're not totally wrong. But back in medieval Europe, buckwheat was the backup crop that could save the day when everything else seemed to be falling apart. You know how when dinner burns, and you just call for takeout? Buckwheat was like medieval takeout, always ready to step in when the main course, that is to say, your regular crops, couldn't make it. Here's the thing about buckwheat. It's not actually related to wheat at all. Weird, right? It's a seed that's part of the rhubarb family, which just adds to its quirky nature. Despite its odd family ties, buckwheat was a fast-growing crop that could be harvested in as little as 10 to 12 weeks. That made it a lifesaver when other crops needed more time to mature. Picture this. It's late summer. Your barley and wheat crops didn't do so hot because of poor weather. And suddenly, buckwheat is there to save the day. Harvest it quickly, and boom, you've got food for the winter. It was like a medieval miracle crop, popping up just in time to prevent a food crisis. Buckwheat was also incredibly versatile. Medieval cooks didn't just use it for making porridge, though. To be fair, they loved their porridge. They also made rustic bread, pancakes, and yes, even beer. Imagine a dark, hearty beer made from buckwheat instead of barley. It was a cheap, nutritious alternative to barley beer. And in a world where clean water wasn't always safe to drink, that beer became a key source of hydration. So, while we might be sipping on craft beers today, medieval folk were washing down their bread and stew with a nice, hearty mug of buckwheat brew. But buckwheat wasn't just a great option for the kitchen, it was also a champion for the land. This crop was particularly effective at improving soil quality. Its dense growth suppressed weeds and prevented soil erosion. Plus, the root system released compounds that made phosphorus more available to the plants. It was like a secret weapon for farmers who needed to make sure the soil stayed healthy and productive for the next season's crops. If you ever wonder how medieval farmers kept their lands fertile without modern fertilizers, you can thank buckwheat. Now, while buckwheat had all these amazing properties, it didn't necessarily have a long shelf life. As agriculture evolved, crops that were more easily stored and had higher yields became more popular. Buckwheat, with its unique growing habits and short shelf life, started to lose favor. But here's where the plot twist happens. As modern-day farmers and health enthusiasts discover its nutritional value, buckwheat is making a comeback. It's gaining popularity as a superfood that's packed with protein, antioxidants, and fiber. So, while buckwheat may have been forgotten by many, it's being rediscovered today for its unique benefits, both in the kitchen and in sustainable farming. When you think of medieval crops, buckwheat might not be the first thing that comes to mind, but it was absolutely essential in keeping people fed and the land healthy. So next time you're munching on some buckwheat pancakes or sipping a trendy buckwheat latte, just remember, it's got a long, hard-working legacy behind it. Now that we've talked about parsnips and emmer wheat separately, let's take a moment to appreciate how these two crops worked in tandem. Together, they were the power duo of medieval survival, like the peanut butter and jelly of the Middle Ages. If peanut butter and jelly were made from roots and grains and were the difference between life and death, it's easy to overlook how crucial they were, especially when we're used to thinking of potatoes as the ultimate survival crop. But back in the day, parsnips and emmer weren't just staples, they were the backbone of the medieval diet. Emmer wheat, as we know, was the rock-solid foundation for bread, porridge, and all things hearty. It was the go-to for filling up your stomach and providing the kind of calories you needed to survive back-breaking labor. But here's where parsnips came in. Those crunchy, slightly sweet roots were the perfect complement to emmer wheat. Where emmer was dense and substantial, parsnips added a bit of variety. The sweetness of parsnips, especially after being kissed by frost, was like nature's way of providing a little treat during those long, dark winters. Medieval cooks could combine emmer and parsnips in ways that not only made meals more varied, but also stretched what little food they had. A pot of stew? Throw in some roasted parsnips and emmer wheat to bulk it up. A loaf of bread? Why not add a bit of parsnip to give it a unique flavor and texture? And, of course, that hearty emmer bread was the perfect vessel for slathering on some mashed parsnips, because if you weren't eating parsnips with your bread, were you even doing medieval life right? Together, these crops did more than just nourish. They kept people going when everything else was failing. When emmer wheat was scarce or hard to come by, parsnips could fill the gap and provide enough calories to keep people from starving. And when the parsnips couldn't be harvested or the soil wasn't suitable, emmer wheat could pick up the slack. The two complemented each other like a great tag team, each taking a turn to shine when the other was in need. What's even more remarkable is that these two crops were more than just survival food. They were also essential to the medieval agricultural system. By rotating crops like emmer wheat and parsnips, farmers kept the soil healthy and productive. The deep, nutritious roots of parsnips helped break up compacted soil, allowing air and water to reach the lower levels, while emmer wheat's hardy stalks provided stability and kept the soil from eroding. It was a dynamic system that ensured the land was constantly being replenished, and that food production could continue season after season. It's amazing how these ancient crops, often forgotten or dismissed in favor of more modern options, were truly ahead of their time. The way parsnips and emmer wheat worked together to sustain the medieval population was a testament to the ingenuity of early farming practices. And while we may not see these crops as often in modern kitchens, there's something deeply satisfying about revisiting them today, especially knowing just how much they contributed to the survival of entire societies. Fava beans. Let's dig into their history, shall we? These little legumes weren't just a humble addition to medieval stews or a protein source for peasants. They were the unsung heroes of the agricultural world. While today we might enjoy them as part of Mediterranean dishes or in trendy vegan recipes, back in medieval Europe, fava beans were a lifeline for many. They provided protein when meat was a luxury few could afford. And in a world where survival depended on being able to stretch limited resources, fava beans were an absolute game changer. The incredible thing about fava beans was how efficient they were to grow. An acre of fava beans could yield 1,500 pounds of dried beans, enough to provide about 500 pounds of complete protein. If you think that sounds like a lot, you're right. To get the same amount of protein from cattle would require 15 acres of grazing land. Talk about an efficient crop. For medieval peasants who couldn't afford to keep livestock, fava beans were a godsend. They were cheap, easy to grow, and packed with nutrients. And for people who didn't have the luxury of daily meat, fava beans were a reliable way to get the protein they needed to keep their bodies moving. It was a crop that worked as hard as its farmers. But the brilliance of fava beans didn't stop there. These legumes weren't just filling up bellies, they were also improving the very soil they were grown in. Fava beans, like other legumes, have a special relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria that thrive on their roots. These bacteria take nitrogen from the air and turn it into a form that plants can use. In short, fava beans acted like a natural fertilizer, enriching the soil for future crops. Farmers in medieval Europe were smart enough to rotate their beans and grains, which meant that after a season of growing fava beans, the soil would be healthier and more productive for the next round of crops. It was crop rotation at its finest, sustainability, medieval style. Of course, fava beans weren't without their drawbacks. People with glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, G6PD deficiency, particularly those of Mediterranean descent, could experience a dangerous condition called favism when they ate fava beans. This condition would cause symptoms like jaundice, anemia, and even organ failure. Medieval societies didn't understand the genetic causes behind favism, but they certainly knew to avoid fava beans if they had a family history of it. Despite this risk, fava beans continued to be a staple in the medieval diet for centuries. Over time, as meat production became more efficient, and crops like potatoes and corn took center stage, the role of fava beans in European agriculture began to decline. But don't write them off just yet. Fava beans haven't disappeared from the culinary world completely. In fact, they've made a comeback in many parts of the world, particularly in North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe, where they're still used to make everything from fava bean flour to hearty stews. Their legacy in modern dishes proves that while trends come and go, some foods have a timeless quality. Fava beans played an essential role in medieval food security. and their impact still ripples through modern culinary traditions. These humble legumes are a reminder that sometimes the most effective solutions to our problems are the simplest ones. And while we may not rely on them as heavily today, the fava bean's place in history is far from forgotten. Let's slow things down a bit and dive deeper into the nutritional marvel that is buckwheat. It might seem like a niche, trendy food these days, particularly popular among gluten-free eaters and health-conscious individuals. But medieval farmers were onto something when they embraced this crop centuries ago. Buckwheat wasn't just some backup plan for when everything else fell through. It was a powerhouse of nutrition, capable of packing a serious punch in terms of protein, fiber, and antioxidants. Buckwheat isn't actually related to wheat, which is always a fun fact to share at a dinner party. You're welcome. It's technically a seed from the rhubarb family, which means it doesn't have the gluten that causes so many problems for people today. But what's more exciting than its gluten-free nature is its complete protein profile. You see, buckwheat contains all 8 essential amino acids, which makes it a complete protein source, something that's not all that common in the plant world. So, while your quinoa might be stealing the spotlight in modern health circles, buckwheat deserves a bit of recognition for offering the same benefits, plus a few extra perks. It's like the overachiever who doesn't get enough credit, but it gets even better. Buckwheat is packed with fiber, way more than white bread, and even more than oatmeal. This makes it an excellent option for anyone looking to keep their digestive system running smoothly. And if you're thinking it sounds too good to be true, wait until I tell you that buckwheat also has an impressive amount of antioxidants. It's richer in antioxidants than some fruits, making it the kind of food that does more than just fill you up. It's like a tiny nutrition bomb that keeps on giving. But let's not forget how buckwheat helped medieval farmers too. Its quick-growing nature meant that it could be planted as a backup crop, harvested in 10 to 12 weeks, and still provide essential nutrients when other crops were too slow to mature. The ability to grow in poor, acidic soil made it a crop that even the most disadvantaged farmers could rely on. Whether you had rocky soil or sandy ground, buckwheat was ready to thrive where other crops might fail. Beyond its nutritional benefits, buckwheat was a key player in improving the land itself. Its dense growth acted as a natural weed suppressant, and its roots helped prevent soil erosion. The way it released compounds that made phosphorus more available to other plants meant that it wasn't just providing food for humans, it was enhancing the soil for future crops too. So, while we might think of it today as just a quirky superfood, medieval farmers knew its value in keeping the entire ecosystem healthy and productive. Despite all of this, buckwheat didn't always enjoy the spotlight. It fell out of favor as agricultural practices evolved, and crops that could be stored for longer periods took precedence. Buckwheat, with its short shelf life, wasn't the best option for long-term storage. But now, as we look for more sustainable, nutrient-dense crops to tackle modern food security challenges, buckwheat is seeing a resurgence. In fact, it's being rediscovered not only for its health benefits, but for its potential to support more sustainable farming practices. So, who knew that this medieval crop would become a superfood of the modern era? If you ever find yourself debating whether to grab that trendy gluten-free granola or your usual oatmeal, just remember, buckwheat has been there, done that, and probably did it better. It's the unsung hero of medieval nutrition, and it's making a quiet comeback today, as people realize just how nutritious and adaptable it truly is. By now, you've probably started to notice a theme. These medieval crops weren't just random bits of food tossed together in a stew or mashed into a loaf of bread. No, they were part of a finely tuned agricultural system that allowed people to survive and even thrive in some pretty tough conditions. From the resilience of parsnips to the versatility of emmer wheat, and from the nutritional punch of fava beans to the soil-improving magic of buckwheat, each crop played a role in a broader cycle that sustained entire communities. The key to medieval agricultural success was rotation. Crops like emmer wheat, fava beans, and buckwheat weren't just planted in a random order, They were rotated in such a way that they would support one another, keep the soil fertile, and ensure that harvests could continue year after year. For example, after a season of growing wheat, farmers would plant legumes like fava beans, which helped fix nitrogen in the soil, improving its quality for the next cycle. Then, buckwheat could be added as a quick-growing crop to enrich the soil further. This careful balance kept the land from being overworked and ensured that there would be enough food for everyone. It was sustainable farming before sustainability was even a buzzword. The rotation system wasn't just a matter of making sure food was available. It was a lifeline. If one crop failed due to bad weather or disease, another could step in to fill the gap. When the wheat was scarce, parsnips could provide extra calories. And when the soil was starting to lose its nutrients, fava beans and buckwheat would come to the rescue. This system made medieval farming incredibly resilient, even in the face of unpredictable weather and other challenges. It wasn't foolproof. Of course, there were plenty of famines throughout history, but it was a strategy that allowed communities to survive when times were tough. Let's not forget that these crops weren't just about food security, they were also about community. In medieval Europe, farming wasn't a solitary endeavor. It was a communal effort, with entire villages working together to plant, harvest, and care for the crops. The success or failure of these crops could determine whether a community thrived or fell apart. The seasonal rhythms of planting, tending, and harvesting created a shared experience that bound people together. And while we may take modern conveniences like grocery stores for granted, back then, everyone had a stake in the crops. So, what's the legacy of this medieval agricultural cycle? Well, it's not just about the crops themselves, though they've certainly made their mark in history. It's about the sustainability, the community spirit, and the deep connection to the land that these farming practices cultivated. Today, as we face new challenges related to food security, climate change, and sustainable farming, we can look to these ancient systems for inspiration. The principles of crop rotation, resilience, and cooperation are as relevant now as they were hundreds of years ago. If anything, the medieval agricultural cycle is a reminder that farming isn't just about food, it's about life. The crops that sustained people back then were more than just fuel for the body. They were a symbol of survival, of community, and of the human ability to adapt and thrive. And as we look forward to a future where sustainability is key, the lessons from these ancient agricultural practices might be just what we need to ensure that our own future is secure.